Have you ever wondered what happens when a guy who only understands PowerPoint charts fires the one person keeping a $100 million machine alive? They called me dead weight. They claimed I was an obsolete engineer blocking corporate innovation, but they had no idea I was the heartbeat of the entire facility. This is how a wildly arrogant man paid for his mistake while locked inside a glass room. Hello and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank all of you for being here. But unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely zero operating budget to keep bringing you these narratives. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon, where you can access exclusive, much longer true stories with deeply detailed situations we simply cannot publicize on YouTube, all performed by multiple emotional voice actors, bringing every single character to life. You can easily join by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link located down in the description or the pinned comment section of this video. Now, let us dive right into today's story, and let me introduce you to Allison Barnes. I am Allison Barnes. At 36 years old, my official title was Lead Systems Engineer at Aegis Biologistics. In reality, I was the invisible mechanic keeping a colossal monster from tearing itself apart. Aegis Bio was a massive cryogenic biopharmaceutical distribution center newly built in New Carthage, Ohio. I was never the loud, charismatic type who dominated boardrooms or commanded attention at networking mixers. In the brutally hollow culture of modern American corporate enterprise, the loudest voices always claim the credit, while the quiet ones are left to actually build the foundation. I was essentially a ghost haunting the climate-controlled server rooms, surviving entirely on double shots of espresso and endless streams of Python code flowing across my monitors. While the executive suite obsessed over color-coordinated slide decks and corporate synergy, I had single-handedly designed the artificial intelligence temperature routing system for the entire $100 million facility. We were only weeks away from the grand opening. This facility was far more than a simple warehouse. It was a fragile, highly volatile organism. Our mandate was to store millions upon millions of doses of highly sensitive vaccines and experimental biological medicines. The margin for temperature error was exactly zero. If the ambient climate inside the holding chambers fluctuated by even a fraction of a degree, an entire batch would spoil instantly. That meant turning life-saving, desperately needed medication into useless, highly toxic sludge. The pressure of that reality was a physical weight crushing my chest every single day. For 2 straight years, I worked 80 hours a week. I sat hunched over my keyboards in the freezing server rooms, building an impenetrable digital fortress. I painstakingly wrote the internal security protocols entirely from scratch. I had to construct a virtual wall thick enough to protect the physical hardware from any external hacking attempts, malware, or catastrophic systemic failures. But corporate America does not care about fortresses, and it certainly does not care about the engineers who bleed to build them. They only care about the quarterly profit margins. Over those 2 years, Aegis Bio went through a dizzying, constant carousel of leadership changes. Every new vice president wanted to immediately make their mark by slashing the information technology budget even further. They looked at my department and saw only a cost center, a massive drain on their projected bonuses. They constantly downgraded our hardware, bought cheaper backup servers, outsourced the lower-level tech support to the lowest bidders, and completely ignored my repeated warnings about infrastructure integrity. Their relentless penny-pinching eventually forced my hand. The Food and Drug Administration mandates incredibly strict, unforgiving safety standards for biological storage. To ensure we somehow met those FDA requirements, despite the constant budget cuts and the fragile new hardware the company insisted on using, I had to get creative. I quietly bypassed the standard, flimsy corporate authentication layers, and engineered a hard-coded biometric lock. I tied this deep-root security measure directly to my personal employee identification number. It was the ultimate fail-safe, a digital umbilical cord connecting my literal physical existence to the facility cooling grid. Without my biometric heartbeat actively pulsing through the mainframes, the system would intuitively assume it was under a hostile attack and instantly shut down all external access to protect the biomaterials. I never once complained about the grueling late nights or the total lack of executive recognition. To me, this entire routing system was my brainchild. It was a beautiful, highly complex symphony of logic gates, sensory arrays, and industrial cooling fans, and I was its sole, dedicated conductor. I spent my nights silently patching critical security holes that the arrogant board of directors did not even know existed. I was the invisible architect, holding up their $100 million dreams with nothing but tired eyes and calloused fingers. When they looked at a corporate spreadsheet, they just saw a replaceable line item. But when I looked at the terminal, I saw a living, breathing ecosystem that required constant, vigilant nourishment. I gave it my absolute life, trusting that my silent dedication was enough to keep the gears turning smoothly. I was incredibly naive to think the men in the boardroom respected the machine the way I did. They only respected the money it promised to print. The illusion of stability shattered on a Tuesday morning with the sudden arrival of Julian Vance. He was the newly appointed Vice President of Optimization, an entirely fabricated title that essentially meant his only job was to aggressively slash operational budgets and make the profit margins look incredibly attractive to our upcoming private investors. Julian was a man in his early 40s who moved with the slick, manufactured confidence of someone who had never actually built anything tangible in his entire life. He wore impeccably tailored Italian suits that probably cost more than my monthly salary and possessed a vocabulary consisting entirely of meaningless corporate buzzwords. He did not see physical servers, freezing cooling pipes, or critical safety infrastructure. He only saw dollar signs and completely unrealistic optimization metrics. Almost immediately, Julian paraded into my server room trailing a team of incredibly cheap, outsourced technology contractors. They looked like college students who had barely skimmed a basic networking textbook, and they stared at my multi-tiered monitoring screens with absolute bewilderment, without even bothering to ask for a system architecture review or inquiring about the physical layout of the facility. Julian stood in the dead center of my meticulously organized control room. He gestured vaguely at the server racks and declared my entire operational setup to be horribly bulky, painfully manual, and severely lacking in agile cloud flexibility. His grand vision was to migrate the entire facility command structure to an off-site, budget-tier cloud server. He believed this would magically save thousands of dollars on local electricity bills and hardware maintenance, completely ignoring the massive physical risks involved. I tried my absolute best to stop him. I stood my ground in front of his gaggle of confused contractors and clearly explained the brutal, unforgiving reality of the Food and Drug Administration compliance laws. I looked right at him and said, "Julian, you cannot simply migrate physical temperature control routing to a cheap public cloud server located 3 states away. The biological storage regulations require zero latency and localized, hardwired failsafes. If the external internet connection drops for even 5 minutes, the automated routing will lag. The internal climate will spike, and we will lose the entire medical inventory before your cloud even registers a warning." He just laughed. It was a terribly condescending, hollow sound that echoed off the cold steel walls. He looked down at me, adjusted his perfectly tied silk cravat, and sighed dramatically. "Allison, you engineers always think the sky is falling. You are intentionally overcomplicating a very simple data storage issue just to make yourself look indispensable. The cloud is the future of corporate infrastructure. We are migrating immediately, and your outdated, paranoid manual oversight is no longer required here." The final, fatal blow came exactly 2 days later, during an exhaustive, all-management operational alignment meeting. The massive glass-walled conference room was packed tightly with department heads, ambitious project managers, and executive sycophants desperate for Julian's approval. Julian stood proudly at the head of the long mahogany table, projecting a massive, color-coded financial spreadsheet onto the interactive smartboard. He was doing what guys exactly like him always do best, performing a highly theatrical display of his own perceived brilliance to an audience of yes-men. He tapped a silver laser pointer against the screen, slowly circling the operational expenditure column. Then, he moved the bright red dot directly over my specific department budget, and finally, he rested the laser point right onto my exact annual salary. The room went completely, uncomfortably silent. The tension was so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. True corporate efficiency is all about aggressively trimming the fat, Julian announced, his voice carrying a sickeningly proud, theatrical cadence. He turned to look directly at me, making absolutely sure every single person in the room followed his arrogant gaze. And right now, looking at these metrics, our system analytics department is severely overweight. We have supposedly built a state-of-the-art automated facility, yet we are somehow still paying premium executive salaries for redundant manual oversight. I sat perfectly still in my chair, my hands folded neatly on the table, absolutely refusing to give him the satisfaction of a visible emotional reaction. Julian leaned forward, resting his perfectly manicured palms heavily on the table. I am looking at the raw numbers. Allison, and to be perfectly blunt, you are dead weight. You are nothing but an overpaid babysitter for a system that can run itself. My outsourced integration team has already fully analyzed the back-end framework. It is basic, entry-level logic coding. We simply do not need a permanent babysitter collecting a senior salary to watch a machine that does not need watching. A collective, barely audible gasp rippled through the middle management attendees. But absolutely nobody dared to speak up or defend me. The brand new vice president of optimization had just publicly executed the lead systems engineer for sport. Effective immediately, your position at Aegis Bio is permanently terminated, Julian declared, his voice echoing off the expensive glass walls. You have exactly 1 hour to surrender all administrative cloud passwords, hand over your root credentials to my lead contractor, and clear out your desk. I want you completely off the company property before the grand ribbon-cutting ceremony next week. We absolutely cannot have disgruntled former employees ruining the prestigious press event. He fully expected a massive fight. He expected me to cry, to frantically beg for my job, or to scream about how deeply unfair this entire ambush was. He was desperately, visibly waiting for an emotional outburst so he could immediately call security and have me dragged out of the building like a hysterical, unstable subordinate. That would perfectly cement his dominant alpha status in front of the entire silent management team. I did not give him a single, solitary drop of satisfaction. I calmly pushed my ergonomic chair back, stood up with perfect posture, and looked him dead in the eye. "Understood," I said softly. My voice was as flat and freezing cold as the liquid nitrogen currently flowing through the lower warehouse pipes. I turned my back on the silent room, walked out of the conference center, and headed straight back to my main terminal in the server room. The outsourced contractors were already hovering around my desk like vultures excitedly waiting to pick at a fresh carcass. I sat down and pulled up the primary access portal. I did not angrily delete anything. I did not sabotage the Surface files or plant any malicious viruses. I simply typed a few final, very specific command lines into the terminal interface to cleanly detach my visible presence. I neatly bundled up the superficial cloud access keys, the front-facing dashboard logins, and the entirely useless aesthetic monitoring passwords into a single folder. I handed a small, silver flash drive containing those completely useless keys to Julian, who had eagerly followed me down the hall to personally ensure I did not damage any precious company property. Then, I unclipped my employee identification badge from my belt. The plastic card felt unusually light in my hand after carrying it for 2 grueling years. I placed it gently on top of my mechanical keyboard. "Everything you asked for is right there on the drive," I told him, slinging my heavy leather messenger bag over my shoulder. Julian snatched the drive from my fingers and smirked triumphantly. "See, that was not so hard. Goodbye, Allison. Good luck finding a company stuck in the past." I turned to walk away. As I reached the heavy, reinforced steel doors of the server room, I glanced back over my shoulder at Julian. He was already eagerly plugging the drive into the system, totally and blissfully oblivious to the invisible, catastrophic trap he had just enthusiastically sprung. I allowed a faint, knowing smile to finally cross my face. I did not say another word to him. I just pushed the door open and walked out into the bright afternoon sun, leaving them all inside a perfectly locked cage of their own arrogant design. In the immediate aftermath of my departure, Julian Vance practically floated through the executive suites. He marched directly into the sprawling corner office of Marcus Thorne, the chief executive officer of Aegis Bio. Bearing what he considered a monumental victory, Julian proudly slapped a revised budget forecast onto Marcus's pristine glass desk, eagerly pointing out that he had just saved the corporation exactly $200,000 annually simply by eliminating what he termed an egregious personnel redundancy. Marcus, a man whose entire moral compass was dictated by quarterly shareholder returns, commended Julian on his ruthless efficiency. They shared a self-congratulatory toast of aged scotch, fully convinced they had successfully excised a useless parasite from their shiny new corporate body. Down in the server room, Julian's team of bargain bin contractors officially took the reins. To their absolute delight, everything appeared to run perfectly. The massive monitors displayed a soothing array of green lights and stable temperature graphs. The sleek, user-friendly web dashboards I had built for the executives hummed along without a single glitch. Julian checked the cloud portal from his phone every few hours, watching the internal climate metrics hold steady at perfectly optimal levels. Every green checkmark on his screen was another stroke to his massive ego. He genuinely believed he had exposed my fraud. He thought the complex climate routing system was nothing more than an unthinking appliance, something you could just plug into a wall outlet and completely forget. He strutted through the hallways, boasting to anyone who would listen about how the supposedly critical engineer was easily replaced by a few basic cloud scripts. While Julian was busy writing his triumphant grand opening speech, I was already 300 miles away, driving a heavily loaded sport utility vehicle straight into the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. For the first time in 3 agonizing years, my phone was powered off, sealed in a plastic bag, and tossed into the bottom of the glove compartment. I had meticulously planned this exact route months ago, long before Julian even stepped foot in Ohio, specifically targeting an isolated cabin completely devoid of cellular service, landlines, or internet access. The heavy scent of pine needles and damp earth replaced the sterile, recycled ozone of the server farms. As I built a crackling fire outside my wooden cabin, listening to nothing but the wind moving through the ancient trees, I felt a profound sense of absolute peace. It was the icy, terrifying calm that always precedes a devastating storm. I knew exactly what was coming, and I was perfectly content to sit by the fire and let it happen. What Julian completely failed to understand in his blind rush to optimize my department was the fundamental difference between software interfaces and physical infrastructure. The silver flash drive I handed him contained the administrative keys to the digital dashboard. It was essentially the steering wheel of a simulation game. It looked exceptionally pretty. It reacted to basic inputs, but it was not actually connected to the physical engine of the building. The true engine, the brutal, unyielding Food and Drug Administration compliance protocol, was buried deep beneath the concrete floors in the physical power grid itself. To prevent remote hacking, malicious malware injection, or catastrophic software failure from the outside, the core cooling grid was deliberately not run from the cloud. It was hardwired to require a physical biometric handshake to prove that a legally qualified human administrator was physically present on the premises to oversee the volatile biological cargo. That strict security measure was inextricably bound to my unique biometric signature. The internal system was designed to operate completely autonomously, but only for a strict maximum of 7 days. If exactly 168 hours passed without my physical fingerprint scanning the main floor terminal to verify system integrity, the internal logic gates would automatically trigger a critical safety failure protocol. the artificial intelligence would immediately assume the facility had been abandoned, severely compromised by an external threat, or structurally breached. So, deep within the frozen, pitch-black core of the Aegis Bio Central Server Bank, a silent countdown had immediately begun the very second I lifted my identification badge off my keyboard. It was an invisible, digital guillotine, slowly rising to its inevitable peak. Back in New Carthage, the final preparations for the grand opening were in full, chaotic swing. Caterers were frantically busy assembling silver platters of expensive appetizers. Event planners were draping massive blue and white silk ribbons across the towering glass lobby. Cases of premium vintage champagne were being carefully chilled for the upcoming elite reception. The board of directors was flying in on private jets from across the country, completely oblivious to the terrifying fact that they were preparing to celebrate inside a rigorously rigged trap. As they ironed their bespoke suits and polished their expensive leather shoes, the silent clock in the concrete basement kept ticking. 6 days, 5 days, 4 days. The countdown bled away, minute by agonized minute, marching steadily toward the exact moment Julian Vance planned to flip the ceremonial switch. The morning of the grand opening was an absolute spectacle of corporate vanity. The VIP observation deck, a massive reinforced glass box suspended directly over the cavernous main cold storage floor, was packed tightly with local media crews, wealthy major shareholders, and eager politicians. Waiters navigated smoothly through the crowded room, balancing silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne. Below them, the sprawling warehouse floor stretched out like a sleeping metallic giant. It was filled with towering, pristine white cryogenic containment units, holding tens of millions of dollars in highly sensitive biological inventory. Marcus Thorne stood near the front of the observation room, beaming with predatory pride as he vigorously shook hands with his biggest investors. At the center of it all was Julian Vance. He held a wireless microphone in one hand and a sleek silver tablet in the other. Completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance and the flashing cameras of the local press, Julian confidently stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone to quiet the murmuring crowd. He launched into a sickeningly arrogant speech about the dawn of a new era of optimized efficiency. He boasted loudly about how Aegis Bio was single-handedly revolutionizing pharmaceutical logistics by trimming unnecessary manual oversight and fully embracing the limitless power of the cloud. He raised the silver tablet high in the air for the television cameras to capture. He proudly announced that with a single, highly optimized touch, he would activate the fully automated neural network of the entire facility. He dramatically counted down for the audience. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. He firmly pressed the full initialization icon on the glass screen. He fully expected a triumphant, cinematic surge of power. He expected the massive facility to light up in a dazzling display of synchronized industrial beauty. Instead, a violent, bone-rattling thump echoed through the deep concrete foundation of the building. It sounded exactly like a massive steel suspension cable snapping under immense, unbearable tension. Instantly, the primary electrical grid disconnected. The deep, vibrating hum of the massive industrial cooling turbines completely vanished, leaving behind a terrifying, unnatural silence that instantly swallowed the entire observation deck. A fraction of a second later, the normal overhead lighting extinguished entirely. The massive facility was plunged into absolute, pitch darkness before harsh, violently pulsing red emergency strobe lights suddenly flared to life. The strobes painted the suddenly frightened faces of the wealthy executives in a demonic crimson glow. The sudden violent halt of the massive airflow system created a rapid pressure vacuum that popped the ears of everyone standing inside the glass room. Confusion quickly rippled through the gathered crowd. Nervous, polite laughter rapidly deteriorated into frantic, frightened whispering. Down on the main floor, safely hidden behind a secondary glass partition, Julian's team of cheap outsourced contractors descended into absolute, chaotic panic. They wildly hammered away at their plastic keyboards, their eyes wide with terror as they watched a relentless cascade of critical error warnings flood their monitoring screens. In a desperate, completely uncoordinated attempt to save their jobs and forcefully restart the frozen grid, the lead contractor made a fatal, unforgivable error. He tried to aggressively bypass the core hardware safety logic to push a manual override command from an unsecured external cloud server. The facility's internal artificial intelligence immediately recognized the unauthorized, brute force digital entry. Because the 7-day biometric timer had expired without my physical heartbeat to verify the safety of the local environment, the system interpreted the contractor's frantic hacking not as a clumsy reboot attempt, but as a highly coordinated, hostile cybernetic attack aimed directly at infiltrating a highly volatile pharmaceutical vault. The automated defense protocol, which I had painstakingly written to perfectly satisfy the most extreme federal security mandates, activated with ruthless, mechanical precision. Maximum lockdown commenced. Massive, reinforced solid steel blast doors violently slammed down from the ceilings across all main entrances and exits, shaking the floorboards. Heavy steel shutters completely sealed off the exterior loading docks. Up in the VIP observation deck, the magnetic emergency locks on the glass doors engaged with a loud, terrifying clack. Thick steel deadbolts slid firmly into place, completely severing the room from the rest of the facility. The air conditioning vents above them hissed their final breath before dying completely. Julian, the chief executive officer, the furious investors, and the terrified journalists were suddenly and completely sealed inside their own luxurious, soundproof glass cage. Marcus Thorne slammed his champagne flute onto a cocktail table, shattering the expensive crystal. He grabbed Julian tightly by the lapels of his expensive Italian suit, his face turning purple with absolute rage. "What the hell did you do to my building?" Marcus roared, his voice cracking with unprecedented panic. Julian dropped his tablet, violently shoving Marcus away and rushing to the heavy glass doors. He slammed his shoulder against the thick glass in a pathetic, desperate display of panic. The doors did not budge a single millimeter. His arrogant, polished corporate facade completely melted away, replaced entirely by the raw, suffocating reality of physical entrapment. Then, the massive digital command screen suspended above the central warehouse floor flickered violently. The glossy, colorful corporate Aegis Bio logo vanished. The screen went completely pitch black. A second later, stark, massive red text materialized across the display, illuminating the entire cavernous room for every trapped executive to clearly read. The automated message was entirely devoid of emotion. It stated clearly that the Food and Drug Administration biometric safety protocol had been critically violated. It confirmed the complete physical disconnection of the primary climate grid to prevent external tampering. Then, the final, devastating sentence appeared in bold red letters, burning itself into Julian's retinas. Awaiting physical authentication from Supreme Administrator Allison Barnes. The body heat of 50 panicked people trapped inside a sealed glass box caused the temperature in the observation room to climb rapidly, causing sweat to pour down their designer suits. But that suffocating physical discomfort was absolutely nothing compared to the true financial disaster rapidly unfolding on the screens. Directly below the main warning text, the live temperature gauges for the main cryogenic containment units were clearly displayed. Without the massive cooling turbines actively pumping liquid nitrogen, the ambient heat of the warehouse floor was slowly beginning to creep into the insulated biological chambers. The digital numbers ticked upward, 1/10 of a degree by 1/10 of a degree. Every single fractional decimal point represented millions of dollars of delicate vaccines inching closer and closer to total, irreversible destruction. The countdown to absolute financial ruin had officially begun. And they were forced to watch it happen from a locked cage while I was hundreds of miles away. Absolute pandemonium immediately consumed the sealed observation deck. The terrifying reality of the impenetrable steel blast doors and the completely dead ventilation system settled over the wealthy executives like a suffocating, heavy wool blanket. The temperature inside the glass box began to rise aggressively with every passing minute. 50 panicked people breathing the exact same stagnant air caused the ambient humidity to spike to unbearable levels. The scent of expensive imported cologne and designer perfumes rapidly soured into the sharp, bitter stench of pure, unfiltered human fear. Marcus Thorne, a man who had built his entire formidable corporate reputation on maintaining icy, unshakable control, completely shattered. He paced the entire length of the thick glass wall like a trapped, desperate animal. Every single time he looked down at the massive digital temperature gauges suspended over the darkened warehouse floor, his face drained of a little more color. The towering cryogenic cooling units holding the biological cargo were warming up. Millions upon millions of dollars in venture investment capital were slowly melting away into absolute nothingness right before his eyes. Julian Vance had retreated to the farthest, darkest corner of the room. The slick, deeply arrogant vice president of optimization was now trembling uncontrollably. He had violently ripped open his incredibly expensive silk tie, desperately trying to avoid the furious, murderous glares of the billionaires currently trapped alongside him. The catastrophic lockdown protocols I had meticulously designed were absolutely unforgiving. They physically severed the entire facility from all external cellular towers to prevent remote digital intrusions. The expensive corporate cell phones in the pockets of the panicked executives were now completely useless slabs of black glass and brushed metal. It took the frantic private security detail nearly 20 minutes to forcefully pry open a reinforced emergency supply panel hidden in the wall and extract a heavy military-grade satellite phone. Even then, the satellite signal was incredibly weak through the heavily reinforced concrete ceiling. The security chief practically shoved the bulky device into the hands of Marcus Thorne. The chief executive officer immediately dialed his executive secretary back at the corporate headquarters, screaming at her at the absolute top of his lungs to find me. He violently demanded that she locate my exact physical coordinates. He explicitly told her he did not care what it cost, and he certainly did not care what federal privacy laws she had to break in the process. What followed were 4 agonizing, sweat-drenched hours of total psychological torture for everyone trapped inside that room, inside the glass box. The air grew incredibly thin, hot, and brutally oppressive. Several older corporate investors had to physically sit down on the carpeted floor, loudly gasping for breath, their faces dangerously flushed and damp with perspiration. Marcus constantly wiped his dripping forehead with a soaked linen handkerchief, pacing until his expensive leather shoes squeaked against the floor. Down on the silent warehouse floor, the massive red digital numbers on the emergency display mercilessly ticked higher and higher. The internal climate of the biological storage units was creeping dangerously close to the critical failure point. Every single minute that passed felt like a violent physical blow to the executives. Meanwhile, I was sitting perfectly still on an old wooden porch, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, quietly watching a magnificent hawk circle high above the green tree line. I was completely unbothered, calmly sipping a steaming cup of hot black tea. The profound silence of the deep forest was finally broken by the loud crunching of heavy gravel. A dark green truck belonging to the local park ranger service pulled up directly to my isolated, off-grid cabin. A young ranger stepped out, looking incredibly confused, and handed me a loudly ringing satellite phone. He explained that a very frantic woman from my corporate office had called the main ranger station, crying and begging them to drive out to my exact campsite reservation immediately. I politely thanked the ranger, took a very slow, deliberate sip of my tea, and pressed the green answer button on the heavy device. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the chaos bleeding through the speaker. "Allison!" Marcus roared the absolute second the digital connection opened. His voice was booming out of the speakerphone, echoing wildly around the sweltering, miserable glass room back in Ohio. He sounded completely broken, entirely stripped of all his usual corporate majesty and power. "Thank God we found you. You have to come back here right now. The entire facility is in maximum lockdown. The main cooling grid is completely offline, and the primary cargo is mere minutes away from total, irreversible spoilage." Name your absolute price right now. I will double your old salary. I will triple it. I will personally write you a blank check the second you walk through the front doors. Just tell the security team how to remotely override the system over the phone." I smiled. It was a cold, incredibly satisfying smile that nobody in that sweltering glass cage could possibly see. The sheer, unadulterated desperation in his voice was like beautiful music. I deliberately let the dead silence hang over the satellite connection for 10 full seconds, forcing Marcus to listen to the pathetic sound of his own heavy, panicked breathing. "I cannot do that, Marcus," I replied gently. My voice was completely calm, entirely devoid of any urgency or panic, contrasting violently with his absolute terror. "I am no longer an employee of Aegis Bio. Furthermore, I am just an overpaid babysitter. I am dead weight, completely devoid of any agile cloud flexibility." Did Julian Vance not assure the entire board of directors that the automated system was incredibly simple and could easily run itself? A sickening heavy silence instantly fell over the observation deck. Every single head in the room slowly turned to glare with absolute, unfiltered venom at Julian, who was practically trying to melt into the glass wall behind him. Marcus let out a choked, desperate sound that bordered on a sob. "Allison, please, I am begging you. Julian is a complete idiot. He is completely finished. I am officially firing him right now. Just give us the bypass codes. We are going to lose roughly $80 million of biological assets in less than 2 hours if the ambient temperature rises another 4 degrees. There are no remote bypass codes," I explained with clinical, icy detachment. "The system strictly requires a localized physical biometric scan from the Supreme Administrator. That would be me, and I'm currently enjoying a very peaceful vacation." I paused, listening to the terrified gasps bleeding through the satellite connection. The power dynamic had completely and irreversibly shifted. The invisible ghost of the server room was now holding the absolute power of life and death over the entire corporation. "However," I continued slowly, my voice hardening into a razor-sharp blade, "I might be persuaded to drive back and place my finger on the scanner, but I do not want a simple salary increase. Marcus, I have 3 very specific, absolutely non-negotiable conditions." "Anything," Marcus begged instantly, his pride completely abandoned. "Just tell me what you want, and it is yours." "Condition 1, I stated firmly, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for debate. "I want a legally binding contract immediately drafted, granting me 5% technical equity in the entire New Carthage facility. I will not just be an expendable employee anymore. I will be an owner. Condition 2, I retain absolute, unquestioned authority to reset, maintain, and secure the digital and physical infrastructure. No optimization executives, no outsourced contractors, and absolutely no boardroom interference ever again. If I say a server is required, you buy it. End of discussion." Marcus did not even hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Done. Both are done right now. Our legal team will have the equity contracts drafted, finalized, and ready for your signature before you even reach the company parking lot. What is the third condition?" This was the exact moment I had meticulously designed everything for. The absolute, undeniable, public destruction of Julian Vance. "Condition 3, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. "Julian Vance will sit down right now and write a full letter of resignation by hand. Then, he will stand directly in front of the main security camera inside your glass box. He will read that entire letter out loud, followed by a deeply sincere, highly detailed apology specifically directed to me, openly acknowledging his complete lack of technical understanding. And Marcus, you will use the emergency broadcast network to stream that live security feed to all 3,000 employees across the entire corporate network. Every single person in the company will watch him admit his own catastrophic failure and apologize to the dead weight." The satellite phone practically exploded with loud noise. Julian shrieked, his voice violently cracking with pure indignation and terror. "No, absolutely not, Marcus. You cannot possibly listen to her. This is literal extortion. She is illegally holding the entire company hostage. You cannot let this arrogant, mid-level engineer humiliate me in front of the entire corporate enterprise. I am a vice president. Marcus Thorne slowly lowered the satellite phone away from his sweating ear. He turned his body completely away from the glass overlooking the ruined warehouse and faced Julian. The chief executive officer looked at the man who had just cost him his dignity, his physical safety, and very nearly his entire fortune. The massive digital thermometer on the screen outside flashed bright red once again, warning that total, catastrophic cargo loss was absolutely imminent. Marcus closed his eyes for one brief second, took a deep breath of the foul, sweltering air, and then looked Julian dead in the eye. His expression was a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated corporate brutality. "Write the letter, Julian," Marcus commanded, his voice a freezing, dangerous whisper that easily cut through the stifling heat of the room. "Write every single word she demanded, and you better read it to that security camera like your very life depends on it. Because if you do not do exactly what she says right this very second, I will personally sue you for the entire cost of the spoiled inventory. I will drag you through civil court for the rest of your miserable life. I will legally destroy you until you do not have a single penny left to your name. Do it now." 3 hours later, the emergency broadcast system illuminated every single monitor across the entire corporate network, from the bustling headquarters in New York to the remote satellite offices. Exactly 3,000 employees stopped whatever they were doing to watch the live feed. The video quality was slightly grainy, captured by the mounted security camera inside the observation deck, but the audio was crystal clear. Julian Vance stood directly in the center of the frame. He looked absolutely atrocious. His expensive Italian suit was completely soaked in sweat and wrinkled beyond recognition. His face was the color of spoiled milk. He held a piece of heavy corporate letterhead in his trembling hands. He cleared his throat, but the sound was weak and pathetic. "I, Julian Vance, am formally announcing my immediate resignation from Aegis Bio," he began, his voice shaking violently. "I confess before the entire board of directors and the corporate staff that I completely misunderstood the fundamental architecture of the new distribution facility. I arrogantly ignored the strict federal compliance protocols. I publicly and wrongfully terminated Allison Barnes, the only engineer who possessed the necessary technical expertise to maintain our biological security. I am deeply and profoundly sorry for my ignorance, and I sincerely apologize to Allison for my completely unprofessional behavior." The exact second he uttered the final syllable of his forced confession, the massive steel blast doors at the primary entrance of the warehouse slowly began to grind upward. The heavy metallic screech echoed through the silent, sweltering facility. I stepped through the widening gap, bringing a sudden rush of fresh, cool afternoon air into the stagnant building. I wore my favorite worn leather jacket and comfortable boots, carrying a large plastic cup of iced coffee in my right hand. I walked onto the pristine concrete floor with slow, deliberate steps. I did not even bother to look up at the glass observation deck suspended above me. I knew exactly who was watching me through the heavy glass, and I knew exactly how desperate they were. I walked straight past the fancy, useless digital terminals that the outsourced contractors had been desperately pounding on for hours. Instead, I headed directly toward a dull, unremarkable gray metal box bolted firmly to a structural pillar in the darkest corner of the ground floor. It was the exact same physical interface module that Julian had previously dismissed as ugly industrial garbage. I flipped open the heavy steel latch. Inside lay the true heart of the $100 million beast. I took a slow sip of my iced coffee, placed the sweating plastic cup on the floor, and reached into my pocket. I pulled out a heavy, encrypted black drive and firmly slotted it into the primary terminal port. The small screen instantly demanded authorization. I pressed my right thumb against the glowing biometric glass pad. The machine chirped, confirming my biological signature. Finally, I placed my hands on the rugged mechanical keyboard and rapidly typed a complex, completely uncrackable 16-character authentication sequence. I slammed the Enter key with singular authority. For exactly 5 seconds, the massive warehouse remained perfectly, terrifyingly silent. Then, a deep, resonating roar erupted from deep beneath the concrete floorboards. It sounded like a sleeping dragon suddenly drawing a massive breath. The primary electrical grid violently surged back to life. A blinding wave of brilliant white light aggressively chased the darkness away, illuminating every single aisle of the colossal structure. Above me, the gigantic industrial cooling turbines shrieked as they instantly engaged at maximum capacity. A powerful, freezing blast of artificial wind swept across the warehouse floor. On the massive emergency display monitors, the terrifying red warning text instantly vanished, replaced by a soothing cascade of stable green metrics. The ambient temperature inside the cryogenic storage units immediately began to plummet back down to the strictly mandated safe zones. With a loud, synchronized clack, the magnetic deadbolts on all the emergency lockdown doors instantly disengaged. Up on the observation deck, the heavy glass doors finally slid open. Marcus Thorne and the wealthy investors practically stumbled out onto the metal catwalk. They were gasping for the freezing, circulated air, loosening their collars and clinging to the handrails. Marcus looked down at me from the balcony, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and profound reverence. He knew I officially owned a piece of his empire now, and he knew he could never, ever challenge my authority again. A few moments later, Julian Vance slowly descended the metal staircase. He clutched his expensive leather briefcase tightly against his chest. He looked completely shattered, stripped of every single ounce of his former corporate arrogance. He kept his eyes glued firmly to the concrete floor as he walked past me, desperately hoping to just disappear into the afternoon sun. I picked up my iced coffee and took one final, leisurely sip. As he tried to slip past my shoulder, I finally turned my head and looked directly at him. "Julian," I said softly, causing him to freeze completely in his tracks. I let the silence hang for a moment, savoring the absolute destruction of his ego. "Next time you want to throw away dead weight, make sure she is not the one holding your gravity key." I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the ruined executive, leaving him to walk out in total disgrace, and walked confidently back toward my server room, leaving the $100 million system obediently humming under my absolute command. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey and want to support the channel, please consider joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon. You will get access to the absolute best, most intense exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publicize on YouTube due to their incredible detail and raw emotional intensity. You can easily scan the Patreon QR code currently on your screen, or just use the direct link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next one.